I took this photo back in March of 2011, just after I'd come around from surgery on both of my knees at the same time. A year or two earlier, I was trying to lose some weight. I'd started working out, running, cycling, and I developed this pain in my knees that gradually got worse and worse. I went to see the doctor, who then referred me on to the surgeon, which led to me having these arthroscopic procedures that you can see in the picture behind me. 6 months down the line, though, it was pretty clear that the surgery hadn't actually solved the problem, though. I was still in just as much pain as I was before, and I still couldn't exercise. And I only found out why when I met this lady. Her name's Nicole Parsons. She was a sports rehab expert who explained to me, to my shock and horror, that the problem had nothing whatsoever to do with my knees. From my shoulders, down through my back, into my hips and glutes, all of these different muscle groups were imbalanced. My hips in particular were twisted this way, and this way, which meant that when I ran or squatted or anything like that, it put tremendous strain on that knee joint, which was what was causing the pain. But her point was fundamentally that no amount of intervention at the knee itself was actually going to solve the problem. What I needed to do was get these muscle groups rebalanced, and then the knee would take care of itself. And true to her word, that's exactly what happened, and I was back up and running again in no time. Now, it struck me during one of my sessions with Nicole that what I was experiencing here with my knees and hips was pretty similar to what we often experience at work. Whenever we face a problem or a challenge, we rush in and try and solve it right there and then, often without thinking about what the real root cause might be. Corporations every year spend millions and millions of dollars optimizing or improving certain parts of their operation that don't really translate into real-world improvements in their performance. Now, why is that? Well, we can trace this back to two fundamental challenges, which are features, if you like, of the modern workplace. The first of which is that we're all specialists, right? So we're all experts, but we're only experts in one small area of the business, which is what we're looking at, right? So the knee surgeon is an expert in knees, and he looks at the knees and he tries to solve the problem there. But if the problem's in the hips and glutes, he misses it, and that happens all the time in a corporate environment as well. We can miss things because we can't see past the horizon line of our expertise or our department. The second, which is kind of joined at the hip, if you like, with the first, is reductionism. A business is an interconnected whole. It's a system, just like the body, right? You can't change one part of it without it having an impact somewhere else, a bit like squeezing a balloon. And even though that makes intuitive sense to most people, when it comes to making decisions, that's not really how we act. We don't really take a systems approach to decision making in business. Instead, what we do is we break things down and we analyze more than we synthesize, and we treat these things in isolation from one another. Now, it's easy to see how if you combine these two things together, if everybody is a specialist who's acting in their own best interest, and if we're not really thinking often about the broader consequences of our decisions, it's easy to see how we can end up with totally unforeseen, unintended, or undesirable consequences, right? And having seen the problems caused by these two challenges playing out time after time after time in all sorts of different businesses, I wanted to do some research and see what people had to say about solving them, right? What did people in business have to say about applying systems thinking to problem solving and decision making? And it turned out actually surprisingly little, in part because most academics and experts are themselves specialists, right? What I found instead is that strategy and decision making as a discipline hasn't really changed that much in decades. Even though the environment has become increasingly volatile or dynamic or fast-paced, we're still using the same kind of slow, cumbersome tools to make decisions that we have done for years. So I began to think, what would solutions to these challenges look like if we were to tackle them head on? What would they look like in an ideal world? And I concluded that the solution to this problem of specialism would be to have some kind of master model that allowed anyone in a business to see all of the factors that determined whether they succeeded or failed, not just the one or two that relate to their discipline. I thought that would be a pretty major breakthrough. The solution to this problem of reductionist decision-making would be if we had some kind of holistic framework that allowed us to consider the broader impact of the decisions that we're making on the business as a whole. And finally, I thought it would be great if we had some kind of modern, lean, or more agile approach to making strategic decisions that not only allowed us to make far better decisions, but to do that in far less time. Well, after working away on this for a good 5 years, we were able to provide a solution to all three of these in one. The result of which is this, the grid. It's a book, it's a framework, it's an approach to decision making, it's a way of life, perhaps, if you're me. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about today. I'm also going to share some of the things that I've learned since we released this around August of last year, and then answer any questions you might have at the end, which I'm really looking forward to. So what is the grid? It's a simple tool for making better business decisions, really, whoever you are and whatever the size or shape of your organization. What makes it unique or different from other approaches is that it's really the first model or tool that allows you to see your business from above, like almost from a space station view. See it as an interconnected whole. And that brings with it several pretty powerful benefits. First of which, you can spot opportunities and risks that you might otherwise have missed, which is a good thing. It can help you prioritize and make smarter trade-offs. We've all got finite resources, so how we use those and how we make those trade-offs or prioritize the things that we pursue can be extremely important. It allows us to collaborate more effectively with people from different disciplines because it gives us a common reference point that we can use when we're making decisions or having those conversations, which should ultimately lead to much clearer and more compelling business cases. Another way of thinking about this, and of course the reason why I've been invited here today, is that it can help you systematically identify the most promising opportunities to innovate. It can help you refine those new product or service ideas that you're working on and shift the odds of project success more into your favor. So, how does it work? Well, to explain that, we need to go right back to the most fundamental question of all and say, what is it that makes for a successful business in the first place, right? And really, there are three things that apply to every kind of successful business. The first, no surprise here, I hope, is desirability. If people don't want what we're selling, we've kind of got a fundamental problem there, right? The second is profitability. If it costs us more to make than we can sell it for, eventually we're going to run out of cash or not be able to give a return to our investors, right? So we've got profitability. And then the third is longevity. The more days we're making that profit for, the better, and nobody wants to buy from or work for a business that might not be around tomorrow. So on a very simplistic level, you can say that a smart decision is one that aims to improve all three of those, or at least makes an informed trade-off between them. You might sacrifice a little bit of profit to build a really durable advantage. You might delete a feature that's kind of only a nice to have, but is very expensive. It makes the product a little less desirable, but makes it a lot more profitable. Right? Really, really simple. Now, what makes doing that in practice difficult, quite simply, is change. What it takes to be desirable or profitable or to have that longevity is changing all the time because our environment is always changing. And we can think of those changes as falling into three fundamental categories too, right? The first of which is the customer. If who they are or what they want changes, we've got to consider that in our decision making or planning because without customers we don't have a business. Nothing clever there. Second layer of change, if you like, is the market. Maybe a new rival comes along, maybe they change the regulations, maybe our category starts to decline. Either way, if we experience changes to the market, we've got to factor that into our decision making too. And then we've got our organization. Right? Maybe we've got a lot more cash than we had in the early days, but we're not as nimble as we once were. If we implement one system, that then constrains the direction that we can go in from there. So we've got these three layers of change too. Now here's where things get a little more interesting. Going back to the overarching theme that everything is interconnected in a business, what we can see is that any one of our three goals can be impacted by any one of these three layers of change. So if we arrange them as a grid, hence the name, it gives us 9 factors which together determine the success or failure of every single business. These 9 factors. So what are they? Start on the top left. What customers find desirable depends entirely on their wants and needs. Right? They don't want or need it, not desirable. Other people in the market will be aiming to satisfy those same wants and needs. That's the rivalry we face. If they're doing a better job, we can expect our stuff to be less desirable. And then we actually have to have some kind of offering for people to buy. The organization has to create something, right? So desirability emerges from the interplay of these three things. If wants and needs stay the same, and the offering stays the same, and one of our rivals does something stupid, they get caught up in some kind of scandal, we can expect desirability to go up without changing anything. Looking across at the profitability column, no surprise that customers give us revenue and the organization incurs costs, but we've also got a market force here in the middle called bargaining power. Every business is sandwiched between its customers on one hand and its suppliers on the other hand. Everybody wants the best deal for themselves, so whoever has the strongest negotiating position in that arrangement gets to keep the lion's share of the profit created by the whole value chain. Looking at the last column, longevity, well, as I've already said, without customers we don't have a business. The larger, more stable or more committed our customer base is, the more insulated we are from change. If those customers are locked into our ecosystem, that can give us a business that can last an extremely long time. The ease with which other people in the market can copy what we're doing, our imitability, can have a huge impact on our longevity. And then finally, we've got our own ability to adapt. Sooner or later, a major change comes to every kind of industry or market, and if we've engineered out of our business the ability to respond to that change, we'll be finished in no time. So those are the 9 boxes of the grid. Now, I'd just like to pause for a minute and draw your attention to some immediate conclusions that we can make, even just looking at these 9 simple boxes. Right? Really basic conclusions. The first of which is that all 9 of these boxes matter. Right? So you can't pick and choose which ones you want to pay attention to. You don't want to go to the trouble of launching a really polished product and spending a fortune on advertising just to find out that it doesn't meet anybody's wants and needs. But it happens all the time, obviously. We also don't want to try and make an entire product out of what is just a feature to some much bigger rival. All we do is we prove the opportunity to them, and then they say, great, we'll take it from here, and they push us out of the market because it's too easy to imitate. Right? So all 9 of these things matter. The second point is that you can't change any one of them without it causing a change to at least one other, sometimes all of the others. Right? So here's a fairly common pattern that we see to illustrate what I'm talking about. A business cuts its costs to increase their profitability, but they do it in such a way that it starts to impact the quality of the offering. Customers aren't too happy about that. They start leaving, or new customers stop buying when word of mouth spreads, or word spreads that the quality has suffered, and revenues start to decline, and all we've really done is cost cut our way into a less profitable business, and now we've got to spend more money trying to defect these problems or trying to win over new customers who are skeptical. And this brings me on to the third conclusion, which is that particularly in organizations of scale, the biggest challenge isn't to be better at our job. It's not competence, it's actually coordination, because what really determines the success of most organizations is the latent impact of the decisions that we're making on these other parts of the grid. Right? Now, of course, it's one thing to say wants and needs are important, or rivalry is important, whatever. It's another thing entirely having a very specific, very structured, very measurable way of thinking about each of these things. Right? So to make the grid as pragmatic and actionable as possible, what we really need to do is introduce one more level of detail that allows us to make very specific decisions about things. And over the 5 years that we worked on this, we're actually able to refine it down to 3 things within each of these boxes. Now, it can be a lot to take in at first glance, but the great thing about this is all of these concepts pretty much will already be familiar to you. So if you look at the revenues box, for example, it's clear that your revenues are determined by your revenue model. Is it subscription or pay-as-you-go? The price that you charge, and then the volume of things that you sell at that price, right? So there's nothing clever there. To build your customer base, first they've got to know that you exist, that's awareness. Then they've got to join you, you've got to acquire them as a customer, that's acquisition. And then you don't want them to go anywhere else, that's retention. The power of the grid isn't in introducing new revolutionary concepts to people, it's in allowing them to consider all of the factors that matter simultaneously when they're making a decision. So rather than going through these 27 things one at a time, which is going to be really boring, what I'm going to do instead is try and bring them to life with a couple of examples that illustrate these 2 key themes. First, that you can't ignore any one of these things, and second, that you can't change one without it having an impact somewhere else. And the first example I'm going to use is a cupcake shop called Need a Cake from my hometown of Reading in England. Now, the lady who owned this business, a lady called Rachel Brown, had a fairly simple goal. She wants to sell more cakes. She wants to increase her sales volume. Right? So she thinks, how am I going to do that? I need to get some new customers. So she's going to focus on acquisition. And in order to acquire those new customers, of course, they need to know that she exists. So she needs to advertise. She needs to raise awareness. This is something that businesses do day in, day out, right? All makes sense. So she thinks, how am I going to do that? How am I going to raise awareness of my little cupcake shop? She's heard of this thing called Groupon, and she thinks, I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to run a Groupon campaign, and I'm going to offer 12 of my cupcakes at a 75% discount, which is going to entice these people to come in and try out my delicious cakes. Now you can see the impact that that decision is going to have on the price right there. It's now 25% of what it is. And she thinks, maybe a couple of people will take me up on this offer. I'll wow them with my delicious cakes and incredible customer service, and then they'll come back for more. What she didn't anticipate, though, was 8,500 people placing an order. I'm not especially good at maths, but I prepared this in advance. That's 102,000 cakes that she's got to make now. Right? Now, if I can draw your attention to the adaptability box here, this is clearly way beyond her current capacity. So she's got a bit of a problem here. How is she going to tackle this problem? Well, she needs to expand that capacity, which means that she needs more people. So she goes to a recruitment agency and she gets some temporary staff. The problem with staff is that you've got to pay them. So now we've got a lower price and we've got a much higher cost. As you can only imagine, trying to scale up that quickly with temporary staff who don't really understand the business and probably don't care anyway, it's no surprise that it's going to have a bit of an impact on the customer experience here. And Rachel starts to worry that this might actually really damage her brand in the long term rather than improving it. But this is a relatively minor problem compared to the much bigger one, which is with this lower price and this higher cost. Each one of these sales is now costing her money instead of making her money. She's burning all the way through her cash reserves, taking her business right to the brink of bankruptcy. It's no surprise then that she described it as without doubt the worst business decision that she'd ever made. But what you can see here is that a change up here is going to always cause changes elsewhere. Now, it would be easy to look at this and say, well, sure, okay, but this is a village cupcake shop. We're a global enterprise. We've got MBAs, we've got gurus, we've got people with decades of experience. It would never happen here. But in fact, this is more likely to happen in a large organization than in a small one, because each one of these individual elements is being managed by a team of specialists who probably have no idea what the other people are doing. And if you're looking for evidence, look no further than these guys, General Motors, who in 2005 posted a $10.5 billion loss after they decided to sell their cars at the same price as they sold them to their own employees. Right? They wanted to increase market share, and yeah, they definitely increased market share. And a few years later, they filed for bankruptcy. This case study comes from this wonderful book by Herman Simon called Confessions of the Pricing Man. Sticking with the automotive theme then, let's talk about these guys for a minute. Now, at some point in 2008, some engineers at Volkswagen realized that they had a bit of a problem with this clean diesel engine that they were going to win with in America. Right? It couldn't be competitive on key factors like performance and fuel economy and meet emissions regulations. Right? So let's plot out on the grid what their options are at this point when they discover that. Option A, we could just sell fewer of these cars. Right? It's not going to be as competitive. We'll lower our sales forecasts and we'll be okay. Right? Don't want to do that though if you're intending to become the biggest car maker in the world, so that's not a very good plan. Option B, we can go to Mercedes and say, yeah, we kind of need that blue tech thing you've been working on. We're going to put that in our cars too to get this emissions thing under control. The problem with that is that now the margin on the product is going to be lower because the cost of making each of those cars has gone up, so we don't really want to do that either. We've got option C, which is we say, oh, let's just abandon this whole diesel idea. Nobody wants diesels in America anyway. We'll make a hybrid or a fully electric vehicle. The problem with that is that then we've got to write off the cost of developing this thing and so on and so forth. And then someone thinks, well, hang on. We've got option D. Why don't we just ignore the regulations and cheat? Right? We can fit this defeat device to the car and we'll be all good. That solves all of the problems in one. I think everybody knows which option they went with. They went with option D, very smart. Now let's see how this played out across the grid when it was discovered that I think 15 million of these vehicles were polluting at something like 50 times the legal limit of nitrogen dioxide. Bit of a clash with customers' beliefs and values, especially if they've been sold this vehicle as they were as the environmentally friendly choice. It clashes with your beliefs about the product, clashes with your beliefs about how a business should conduct themselves. You're not going to be too happy about that. Not going to have a great impact on the customer experience either. You'll be wondering, can I drive this thing? Is it illegal? You're looking at the residual values of your car going down and being unhappy. You think, how are Volkswagen going to handle this? At least I've got to go in for some unscheduled maintenance, which is going to be frustrating. Not going to bathe the brand in glory either, and certainly not going to make this clean diesel proposition any more competitive. In fact, it's not going to be competitive at all because it's been withdrawn from sale. Sales volumes are now going down to zero, so you're not going to acquire any customers with this product either. It's also going to impact your retention because you've got to offer to buy these cars back from people. Saw some amazing footage the other day from the BBC showing these enormous car parks just full of thousands of these vehicles just sat there going nowhere. What didn't make the headlines is that Volkswagen also had to reduce the price of all their other vehicles to get skeptical consumers back into the forecourt, which isn't great. You've got the cost of putting right every single one of these vehicles too, and then you've got the fixed costs here of fines from regulators and class action lawsuits. So when all's said and done, a few lines of software code and ignoring one of these elements has cost you an estimated 16.2 billion euro. What's the point? The point is, every element of this grid matters, right? You can't afford to ignore any one of them. And you can't allow one or two to dominate your decision-making either. You can't become obsessed with increasing volumes or increasing prices or cutting costs without ending up with a kind of imbalanced grid and the organization eventually toppling. The reason for this is that everything in a business is interconnected, right? So you've got to consider the broader impacts of the decisions that you're making. The kind of structured systems thinking that the grid allows you to do can dramatically reduce the risk of these unforeseen, unintended and undesirable consequences. The question is, how do we actually go about using this thing in practice? Well, there are three use cases for the grid that have so far shown to be really valuable for people. First is when you're planning new products or services. The second is evaluating the performance of a current business. And the third, as we've just been talking about, is making strategic decisions. So I'm going to talk you through these now, starting with this, planning a new product or service. To explain how the grid helps here, there's a brilliant quote, I read it in a Clay Christensen book. 93% of all companies that ultimately become successful had to abandon their original strategy because it wasn't working. I got a friend who's a venture capitalist who puts that figure at more like 100%. He says he's never funded a business that's actually succeeded with the original plan. And you can see why when you look at the grid, because you've only got to miss one of these things or end up with some configuration of these things that doesn't work, and you don't have a viable business, right? So we can use the model pretty simply as a checklist, just like a pilot would run before they take off going down the runway. You work your way through each of the elements, you capture and test any hypotheses that you have about each of these, and what that means that you can do is you can stress test your ideas much more thoroughly, much more quickly, and at much lower cost than you can any other way, and that can help you avoid some really classic startup mistakes that we see all the time and that we've seen using this model. So, very common one, a solution looking for a problem. No one knows what the customer actually wants, but we're building it anyway. Doesn't work out too well. Insurmountable adoption barriers can be a huge challenge for some businesses. They think they've got a great product, but no one can adopt it for whatever reason. Maybe it's not compatible with their current technologies or whatever it might be. Launching a product that isn't in a category is a big problem. I know what vodka is, I know what whiskey is, but if you try and sell me whisker, I've got no idea what that means and I don't want to buy it. People like to buy from clear categories, right? So sometimes people try and launch products that aren't in categories and normally come unglued. Calculating your price based on costs is another massive mistake. You've got to work out the price based on willingness to pay. If you base it on costs, you'll either overprice because your costs are too high or underprice and leave profit on the table there. Cost of acquisition is a huge startup killer. I did a project for a startup in Venice recently where nobody there had run a break-even calculation. We ran one and figured out that the cost of acquiring customers was 8 times revenue. So I'm going to last very long with an advertising or marketing strategy like that, but again, it happens all the time. And then of course we have this omnipresent problem of things being far too easy for people to copy. No IP, no durable advantages, and something that anybody can catch up to really quickly. So we can use the grid to work through our startup idea and refine it, keep going back to it until we arrive at some combination that's going to be successful. Second use case. Evaluating existing operations, right? Evaluating the performance of a current business. And we're actually going to go through this now. just like to try and get you to form in your mind an answer to this question, right? Don't tell me what the answer is. Just have a thought in your mind about whether you think that Uber is a successful business. We're going to go through the pros and cons of this business now, using the grid as a structure, and I'm going to be drawing on a really stellar piece of analysis by a transport analyst called Hubert Horan, who wrote an almost 100-page report on this in the Law Transportation Journal. Don't ask me why I was reading that, but let's start looking at Uber. So what's good? Goals are good. They know that people want to get from A to B in a taxi, pretty much. They understand that. If they didn't understand that, no one would be using it at all. So that's good. Adoption barriers in areas where they have high capacity are pretty low. You just download the app, create an account, and you're off and running. So that's pretty good as well. I think we can safely say that they've done wonders for the taxi customer experience more broadly, and that app has a very intuitive, very straightforward user experience. So they've done pretty well there. Double-digit growth. That's not bad. Gross bookings are up 11%, the last stats I saw. Huge awareness of the brand, right? They're virtually synonymous with ride sharing. And then, most important of all, $7 billion in cash. That's quite a lot of money sloshing around. So clearly some strengths there. Now let's have a look at what might not be so good about Uber, starting with the biggest problem of all. No durable advantage. Now, the investment hypothesis behind this business was if they grew big enough, quick enough, they'd have this kind of quasi-monopoly, they'd be able to force everybody out of the market, they'd get these huge economies of scale, and then they'd be able to deliver these staggering returns. But that hasn't happened, right? In fact, it turns out that imitating a taxi app is pretty straightforward. And we can see that because if we look in the Rivalry app, in the Rivalry part of the grid here, you can see that they've lost in China and Russia and several other markets, so pretty hard to claim that you've got a durable advantage there. And even if we look in the markets where there are a dominant presence, like the US, they're facing pretty intense rivalry, and market share has declined, I think, by 7 points, largely due to Lyft. So no real durable advantage, which is a bit of a problem. Pricing and revenues is a bit of a problem too. Because they thought that they could push everybody out of the market, what they wanted to do was undercut all those people. So they've entered the market with low prices, but they can't easily raise those prices because customers can switch to somebody else now. They can switch to Lyft or whoever. So they don't really have the bargaining power that they need with their customers to drive those prices up. We've got exactly the same pattern when it comes to variable costs as well. So that's the cost of actually supplying the service. In a traditional taxi business, fleet management, purchasing of vehicles and servicing them is handled centrally because you have a much stronger negotiating position if you buy 100 cars than if you buy one. But that's not Uber's business model. In Uber's business model, each driver is responsible for buying and servicing, maintaining and fueling their vehicles. So what is ordinarily like a fixed cost has now become a variable cost, right? And they've got these high variable costs that they can't cut without cutting driver pay. And if they cut driver pay, what's going to happen? The drivers are going to switch to somebody else. So they don't have much bargaining power with their suppliers either. They also have the highest fixed costs of anybody in the industry. Right? They've got to run a global brand, they spend a fortune on lobbying, they spend a fortune on legal fees, they've got all the tech R&D that you've got to spend on, you've got customer service. Every time you enter a new market, you've got different challenges with recruitment and that kind of thing. So they actually have the highest fixed costs of anybody in the industry. And what this really means is that they don't really have any economies of scale at all because all of the different markets have different challenges. As they've grown, actually, their losses have grown. Rather than getting these incredible economies of scale that they hoped for. Sprinkle into that some of these regulatory challenges that they've been having. They've had their license revoked in London. There's certainly no shortage of other legal inquiries going on. And some of this damage that they've sustained with their brand recently after revelations about their culture, especially in the leadership of the business. And we might have a wee bit of a problem. As Hubert Horan, who I mentioned, put it, Uber has no ability now or in the foreseeable future to earn sustainable profits in a competitive marketplace. Why? Because they're already making massive losses, they can't increase their prices, and they can't easily cut their costs either. In fact, he goes a little further than that. No Silicon Valley startup has lost anything remotely close to 2.6 billion in their 6th year of operations, and then doubled those losses to 5 billion in year 8, which is where Uber is now. Reversing losses of this magnitude would require the greatest corporate financial turnaround in history. Not such good news for Uber then. The great thing though is we can actually plot all of this really complex analysis on a single page just using the grid. We can consider all of these factors that determine their success or failure and map them out on a single page, take that to our management team, take that to our colleagues and say, these are the strengths and weaknesses of the business that we're working on at the moment. And when you look at these things, this can help guide where you want to focus your innovation activities, right? Because you might look at some of the things that are red and say, oh, we could really do something to improve that if we were to apply these technologies. So this is a real strength of the grid and something that people have found really helpful. They found that it makes the decision-making process, the approval cycle, and the evaluation of their current operations much quicker. Third use case, making strategic decisions. This is probably the most intuitive way of using the grid, and it's really quite simple. All we do is we take the decision that we're planning on making, in this example, maybe outsourcing something, and we consider how that decision would impact all of these different elements. So let's say we're thinking of outsourcing a call center or manufacturing or putting some data in the cloud, whatever it might be. We might start off by saying, well, this is great because we don't have to make all those capital expenditures anymore. We don't need these facilities and all this equipment because now our supplier is going to take care of that. So this might be great. It might reduce our fixed costs because our partner operates at such a massive scale that they've got costs that we could never hope to meet, much cheaper. Great benefit of outsourcing is that you can just buy more or less. It's a more scalable solution, and hooray, all of that complexity and rigidity that's in our business now becomes somebody else's problem. So these might be real benefits. But as we look further afield, we might start to wonder whether there might be some drawbacks. Do we gain any durable advantage from doing this, right? Or might we lose something that currently makes us inimitable if we make this decision? How much bargaining power is this supplier going to have if we lose the ability to do this ourselves, and then they've got all of our data or all of our systems and we've got high switching costs? They're just going to jack the price up as soon as that happens. And we see this all the time with IT vendors. When they get that bargaining power, the prices start going up. How's it going to impact the customer experience or our propositions, both during the transition to this new provider and in the future? And finally, what would our customers think of this decision? Now, this might sound like a weird thing to bring up with an outsourcing decision, but there have certainly been some companies who have got their fingers burnt by outsourcing to things like prison labor or sweatshops. And of course, when customers find out, they're not too happy about that, and it diminishes the appeal of the brand. This kind of thing happens all the time. So the point is that we can use the grid to have these very structured discussions and conversations with people from different disciplines where we can sit down and say, okay, we're thinking of making this decision. How's it going to affect your area? And one of the things that we've seen in using this model is that it's really quite magic, the conversations that people can have with this tool that they just can't have without it. So before we go into the Q&A, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we've learned about both the model and organizations since we released this thing around August of last year. Here are some of the things that we've learned about the model. I'm relieved to say that it does actually work, which is gratifying after spending 5 years working on it, and it works extremely fast in terms of the speed with which people are able to identify strategic holes in their new projects or risks, or the speed at which they're able to make these strategic decisions. We're literally, in some cases, going down from months to a handful of hours, which is really quite incredible to see. We've learned that we've got some work to do on lowering adoption barriers around this tool, something that we've been working on, and I'm going to show you a couple of the ways that we've done that later. The first time that people try it, it can be a little bit intimidating, but by the time they get to their second or third run through it, it's kind of become second nature and they start to really get a lot quicker with it, but we've definitely got to do some work on that. We've also learned that it's definitely not for the faint-hearted. As one CEO told me, it kind of really reveals the truth of the business, the whole truth of your performance. And if you want to know that, then it's great, but if you don't, then it's not so great. And if you're in one of these organizations where people don't like to give other people bad news, or there's a lot of big egos flying around, or a lot of politics, then you kind of want to run away from this model as quickly as you can. those people can't really be helped anyway, so I'm not going to lose too much sleep over that. And we've also learned that it's really as much a communications and alignment tool as it is a decision-making tool. The thing that most people have found valuable about it is the discussions that they're able to have with representatives from different areas of the business and really start to learn the perspective of finance or of marketing or of engineering, of design. What we found is that sometimes people are really realizing for the first time what some of their colleagues actually do for a living when they sit down and use this thing. So that's some of the things we've learned about the model. But we've also learned some really interesting things about organizations in training them to use this model and doing these half and full day workshops where people actually try it out and make some decisions with it or start stress testing some of their ideas. So these are some of the things that we've learned. The first lesson, which we weren't really anticipating, is that really the biggest barrier to effective decision making is ambiguity. So when we run these workshops, we ask people to prepare some decisions or challenges that they're facing that we can put through the grid in the session. And we found that a lot of people actually really struggle to explain what those challenges are in a clear and concise way. They actually often we find that the problems that they're facing aren't really clearly defined at all. And of course, if the problem isn't defined, then you can't easily solve it with the grid. So the problem-solving process actually starts a lot earlier in defining the problem clearly, and that's something that people are struggling with. When we do the workshops, we had an idea that we would break people apart into tables of 6 and they'd all work on the challenge with a flip chart. But we thought that we'd have to give each table a different challenge because otherwise when we got to the read-through at the end, there'd just be massive duplication. They'd all be saying the same thing. That turned out to be completely untrue. What we found instead is that you can give a table of 10 tables the same challenge, even if they're in the same department or same business, and they'll give you 10 completely different answers. Which was a shock even to us, just how inconsistent people's assumptions are and their ideas are when it comes to making decisions. We also found that differences of opinions across different kind of disciplines within the same companies are absolutely massive. Like, we thought, sure, like people from finance wouldn't really understand the marketing view of the world, or people from customer experience wouldn't be so interested in procurement's perspective on the world, but we weren't quite prepared for just how, it's almost like they were from completely different planets, and some of the conversations got extremely heated. And it's really the first time often for some of these people, having used this structure that they can all agree on, that they've really learnt, as I said, what some of their colleagues actually do for a living, and realize someone who's sitting just 3 desks away from you might see the world in a completely different way. We've also found that as we've gone around the grid with people, by far the most common response is just, we don't know. So we don't know what the adoption barriers are. We don't know what the optimum price is. We don't know what the fixed costs are. Right? We found probably people maybe know a fifth of the grid when they start to analyze a decision or a startup idea, but beyond that, most of the time it's we don't know. And that leads me on to the biggest thing that we've learned, which is that, as we assumed at the beginning, really, the latent risk and impact and inefficiency in most decision-making processes is absolutely massive. It's bigger even than we thought, and it's been really borne out by these workshops. The great news for us, though, is that the grid really can help people to make much, much better decisions and make those decisions in far less time, which is great.